Hey, good morning, Mr. Chukwuma.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation because it's a very timely one. Because we do want to leave understandings and experience to a younger generation of nonprofit leaders. And when you think of your own journey and what you've gone through in developing the Clean Foundation and a host of civil society projects in Nigeria, what would you tell yourself? Because I know you went through it organically. You went through the experience of nonprofit leadership and development and management organically. But looking back, what would you tell yourself? What are the lessons that young leaders now can borrow from your experience?
I think the first thing to underscore is that if I have to do it again, it's something I will still do as enthusiastically as I have done uh, in almost 3 decades I've been in the sector. However, there are a few things I'll probably do differently because the times are different. But let me begin with things I did that I will still do again. As you rightly pointed out, it was an organic growth that began with the student movement way back in the university, where the leadership experience was inculcated. So when I left the university, I didn't have to pause and wonder what I wanted to do with my life. I knew the sectors I wanted to be in, and I knew the ones that even if they paid me millions, I would not go in. So that was, it made it easier to decide. And also being in Civil Liberties Organization, which was a pioneer NGO at the time, was like the laboratory that gave birth to most of the human rights groups you have today. So I learned a lot that I tried to apply when I founded Clean. One was the whole challenge around being membership organization and also fund driven. As a membership organization, you draw your powers, or you're expected to draw your powers and resources from your members. But when funding got into it, it created a contradictory relationship between what you owe your funders in terms of a report guided by the grant agreement you signed, and then the membership dimension had different approaches to it. So at the stage, it conflicted. So when one was founding Clean, it was clear that we didn't want to be a membership organization. We wanted to be more of a think tank, so that we will not get into the politics of the members driving you in one direction and the relationship with your donors and those who are funding your activities driving you in a different way. So what I would do differently today, one, it will still be a non-membership, but then we'll have to create more ways of being accountable to the communities, to the beneficiaries, and all of that, because that is part of the challenge today. I mean, our generation of leadership introduced the non-membership think tank approach to work, which helps the organization to grow. But 20 years down the line, you are seeing a severing of that link with the communities and the beneficiaries you serve. They really have no way of holding the organizations accountable. And that perhaps accounts for some of the things you're seeing today where questions are beginning to ask, to whom are this group accountable? In other jurisdictions, regulation would have ensured that. But due to the last regulatory environment we have, people could actually get away with blue murder.
And I'm sure in the 3 decades of being involved in this space, you've come face to face and with the challenges of running, and I recall you taught a course in at Harvard University about this. What are the challenges of running a non-profit in Africa?
Where one is the visioning of the work. Again, I keep going back to where we started in the student movement. We had a vision of society that we wanted to be in. We had a vision of the political system that would best serve the citizens, and that guided the work that we did. We didn't just resort to the traditional of monitoring, reporting, litigation. We also moved to mobilize the citizens when we felt that conferencing will not do it. But today, the kind of leadership you have in the movement, which is the beginning of the challenges for me, is what I call template implementers. You know, you attend a conference in some capitals and hear what some groups are doing, and you come here to adapt it. Without that originality of thought, without that originality of concept and the fit with the environment, because it's working elsewhere and there's perhaps some funding for it, people will do it. So in the long run, you find out doing that, what contribution are you making to normative development? What contribution are you making to knowledge generation and management? You find out that there are very few. Even though the challenges that drive development work in the world are predominant in Africa. But if you look at the contributions of African groups in the non-profit sector, even in the academics, through generation of knowledge to address those problems, they are meager. You can read all the journals and literature on the issue. There are very few, and for me, it's because of that lack of organic link between the sector and the issues that they are driving. So that is one for me. Then the other one is what I call atomization and fragmentation of the sector. Again, it's also traceable to some of the decisions some of us made when we left some of the groups we were working with. Because if you look at the late 80s, many of the groups you had were groups you could call, I wouldn't use a jack of all trades, but they had all aspects embedded in one organization. Take, for instance, the Civil Liberties Organization. It did work in economic and social rights. It did work in civil and political rights. It did gender work. It did environmental rights and all of that. The same thing with the Constitutional Rights Project, and you could add in that means the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights. But when our generation left this pioneer organization to start new ones, we were more focused. For instance, the Clean Foundation was an offshoot of the police project of Civil Liberties Organization. And if you look at so many groups around, you could trace them to, say, Environmental Rights Action, which is a group working on environment in the Niger Delta. It was actually an environmental rights project of Civil Liberties Organization. And you look at many women groups, they just, emerge from women's rights project. But when they move, they specialize, brought more experience and expertise, which is good. But then in atomizing those spaces without any thread running through them, along the line, it became more of a fragmentation. So the whole question is now, where is the family resemblance? What are all these groups trying to achieve, and how are they coordinated in trying that? That is not there, and is a challenge that they need to deal with. And then the other issue is excessive dependency on external funding. If all external funding available for non-profit work in Nigeria is to stop today, over 90% of the groups will go under. So having been in this space for over 3 decades now, there should have been cultivation of domestic constituency for funding, especially for social justice work. There is domestic funding for, work related to religion, work related to education, and work related in some ways to environment and arts. But holding government accountable to the pledges, the policies, and the law, it's difficult to come by local funding to support that work. And we know why that is the case, because the state is the biggest investor in our environment, and many of the businesses here owe their being in existence in one way or the other to the state. So they are not in a haste to fund activities that may bring them in some conflict with the state. That's one. But then the other one is actually taking the pains to cultivate this local funding. It might come in trickles, but over time it will be sustainable. Groups don't want to do that, because what it takes you to raise, say, $1,000 is the same thing it takes to perhaps raise $1,000,000. So if you have external funding providing so much with the same minimal amount of, why devote much time to, snapping little funds here and there locally, forgetting that actually in cultivating that and growing it over time, it will make you much more sustainable than this, because external funding comes in cycles. It goes with the priorities and strategies of the group making the money, and it does change every 3 to 5 years. So if you are caught on the wrong corner, you just wake up one day and find out that there is no money available. Another challenge is succession planning, beginning with addressing key man risk. You have a situation where in many organizations today, if you remove the founder director, you don't really have sufficient capacity and expertise to do the work. So the whole thing revolves around the founders, making it difficult for the organizations to grow when they wake up one day and decide to do another thing. Because they do. I mean, somebody may wake up one day and say, I want to go into politics, I want to become a consultant. The organization suffers. And this is traceable to not planning, having a system and strategy in place for growing the next generation of leadership, and really giving them the space and responsibility to grow in the function. And that ultimately affects the growth of the organization. And there are so many other challenges out there. One is also, unlike in other jurisdictions where you have very strong national organizations uniting CSOs, either by way of network, coalition, or that acts as the conscience of the movement, contributes in growing the sector either through annual conferencing or having capacity programs that helps in building. In Nigeria, we have failed to do that. You may just have some networks, but they are all aggregate around the organization hosting the secretariat, to the point that almost all of them are privatized in one way or the other. So these are the areas we really need to pay attention to if we want to grow the movement, in addition to the government having a mechanism for supporting this sector, because you can't really regulate and hold a sector accountable where the government itself is not making any investment towards the sustenance of that sector.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you talked about a number of challenges, and these challenges are really interconnected in a way, and they define the future for the sector. Um, let's take two key ones. You mentioned the problem of succession, and then the problem of knowledge generation to drive the evolution of the sector, in that it's learning from itself and developing a common pool that others can draw from and go ahead. What what do you what how do you think this can be surmounted?
Yeah, that's actually, since I joined the Ford Foundation, I'm in my 6th year now. In the past 4 years, I have devoted significant attention and resources of the foundation towards addressing this. So one of the first initiatives I supported was to work with leaders here to create an association that would contribute in that knowledge generation and management originality. I think it was Mutua Macau who wrote a book on NGOs in East Africa, normative and political organic link between the academics, scholars who have interest on civil society, and the practitioners, the leaders in the sector. You know, bringing them together to enrich and reinforce one another. Because in our universities, not just in Nigeria but across Africa, they complain about resources for research.
Yeah.
Now, within the non-profit sector, they have some resources for short action researchers, but no capacity to actually do it, which leads to, you know, this derisive name of NGO publication, self-publication. Yeah. So the whole idea of supporting the Association for Research on Civil Society in Africa was to bring these two communities together and learning from experiences elsewhere. For instance, the Association for Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Action in the US, which has been in existence for over 40 years, and bringing the two units together, that's the scholars and working with them to produce, in fact, one of their products. This non-profit and voluntary sector quarterly is the #1 peer-reviewed article journal in that sector. So we have worked with them over this, supported them over these 3 years to help to nurture this organization. And right now, it's been on, and they do every year conferences, and they are floating a journal too, and they have a scholarship scheme for supporting PhD students who are doing their research on civil society, to give them stipend that will enable them to do proper field work and produce knowledge. That's one. Then the other one is what I started last year here, is a fellowship, it's NGO Leadership Transition Fellowship, you know, where we are working with leaders in the sector who have gotten to that stage of asking themselves, what next? Unlike what happened in our past, where whatever we did was through self-help, raw courage, and bundle of enthusiasm. But this one is a program that will support organizations, their leaders and board, who think that their leaders have reached that stage where they need to transit. So they take time off from work, spend a semester in a university. We began with universities in the US, help them to think through their transition plan, help them to document their experiences over the period they've run this organization, and come back to implement the plan they have. We are now in the second cohort of that. That is contributing. And also the partnership we have with Lagos Business School through the NGO Leadership Management Program. And I believe the publications that you guys are planning is all about leaving things behind, leaving framework, leaving infrastructure that will help the movement grow. Because the truth is that even though the movement has done so much, played a critical role in ending military rule in Nigeria, but as a sector, it has not grown institutionally. And if it doesn't grow, it will die. It may be like what we in the Southeast described, that a water you pour on cocoyam leaf, it will run off without leaving a trace. So all these things are geared towards contributing to ensure that the infrastructure for sustainability of the sector in Nigeria and beyond is firmly led.
Okay. And in laying that infrastructure, what are as much as there are challenges in the environment, what are the peculiar opportunities that exist in this environment that can support creating a common wealth, if you want to call it, for NGOs?
Yeah, I think for me, the most important and exciting opportunity is the number of young people who are interested in solving social problems. It used to be like that during our time because it was a difficult enterprise. It was when you had military rule, and anybody who identifies with the social sector, in particular the human rights movement, is a target of harassment. That is not the case today. So with this army of young people who are graduating every year, wanting to be involved in it's easier for groups to tap into that, have more volunteers. So you can actually run an NGO today on a lean pause, drawing from this army of volunteers. Then the other one is also technology. The technology for easing things, for aggregating opinion, for whatever you want to do is readily available, and many of them are open source and free. So you don't have to pay for proprietary fees to use them if you really know where to source them. And many of these technology companies today, whether it's Microsoft, Google, Facebook, they have a product that support social enterprises, non-profits, at little or no cost. But the question is whether groups are aware of this. And in addition to many courses today that are offered around the world, whether online, people can actually educate themselves. It didn't used to be like that. I mean, whether it's Coursera, you have all kinds of open source free courses on every imaginable thing, and many of them offered by Ivy Leagues, Stanford, Harvard. Everybody wants to give because the whole university system and knowledge curation is being rethought. People think now you don't have to spend 4 or 5 years in university, studying things that you may never use for the rest of your life. So they are calibrating them in such a way and modularizing them that you can go and pick the one that helps you and apply it. So I think all these are vast opportunities, and there's also a growing, let's not forget, local philanthropy is growing in Nigeria. You have all the foundations that are set up by high net worth individuals and corporations. Yes, they are restricted to funding in some way, but if they are targeted for partnership and cultivating them to realize, yes, the areas you are supporting are good, but this is actually a way to do them sustainably, because without governance, whatever you are doing can only be self-help and not sustainable. So the opportunities abound. It's just for people to get up and take advantage of them.
Interesting. And you spoke about governance. The thought that came to my mind was leadership. What can we say about leadership in the sector? Because you did speak about this NGO leadership transition program. Yes, that tries to address the problem of succession. But is there also a problem around leadership and governance of these institutions we call non-profits, NGOs?
Yeah, there are, and they exist at two levels. One challenge there is the lack of pipeline for leadership renewal in the sector. When we got on board, the student movement served as that pipeline, which was why I said at the time we left university, we had made up our mind about where we want to go and what we want to do with our life. So we didn't need to be persuaded, to be sweet-talked and all of that. And the example I give for this, wherever I talk about this, is Salihu Lukman, who was NANS president, National Association of Nigerian Students, in 1989. At the time he was NANS president, and up to the time he graduated, his uncle, Rwanu Lukman, was the Minister for Petroleum. But when he graduated, he went to work for Nigerian Labour Congress. Today, young people would want to work, who have such uncles, would want to work with NNPC or any of the blue chip oil companies. But he was already decided that he was going to devote his life to the social sector. And that was the role Nance played in his life. But today, we don't have such pipelines. So young people come into the movement through what I call I beg to apply. I have looked for all the blue chip companies. They are not available, and these are the people hiring. Let me go there and mark time. When I see something better, I'll leave. So the passion is not really there for many young people. But I also do understand there are people who, through their background and experiences in life, you know, have made up their mind before. But for the vast majority of them, you didn't have that pipeline. So the importance of pipeline for leadership renewal is good. And I remember in the 90s too, you have this Human Rights Institute of South Africa that organizes this 3 weeks retreat for groups who didn't have the opportunities of having these things inculcated in them in the university to go through that. Today we don't have that. So we bring in people, we first have to acculturate them with the passion that is required. We secondly have to train them for the skills. Yes, the skills are the easier to acquire, but the attitude, they have lost it through the university era where they meet. So we really need to pay attention to that, especially for middle level managers and entry level program officers. There doesn't seem to be enough of attention paid to them in terms of what they need, to grow. Then the other one is also corporate governance. Uh, a lot of people are recruited to serve on the board of non-profit by non-profit leaders just to use their name and register. They hardly have board meetings, and they really don't know what is going on in those organizations. I really have to warn them, because if they know the fiduciary responsibility boards of non-profit have in today's Nigeria, they will think twice before lending their names for causes they have no time to really monitor and play oversight role about what they're doing. Take, for instance, when Nigeria has migrated to international financial regulation, which means that annually NGOs are supposed to do their audit in a comprehensive manner. And part of the requirement of that audit is for all their policies to be embedded in the audit, because that's what anybody assessing the audit will use to know. And the board members are equally expected to be members of professional association, the most common one being the Institute of Directors. And why that is required is that if they fail to play their fiduciary role, the associations they belong can actually be contacted to hold them accountable. Many people do not know this, and they sign up for this. If you have no time to play this role, please don't lend your name, because it could cost you a lot tomorrow if those organizations go on. Then the other thing I need to tell, especially leaders of non-profit startup, when you are starting a new NGO, the belief is that the bigger the names of the people on your board, the better for you to be taken seriously. But that is a very, very erroneous impression, because one, if you go for big name, they will not be available to do the work of board membership. And even though they will not be available, whatever success you make, they will think it's because of their name they learned. I actually had a colleague who ran one of the pioneer groups who, had some of these big names as board members, and they were not really there. And then when the organization started growing, they came one day to try to oust him from the leadership. And then he had to learn his lessons from that. So what people really need is people who are available, one, and then what are they bringing towards corporate governance in the organization. Some people bring financial management skills. Some people bring human resources skills. Some people bring fundraising skills. So you really have to select a variety of people who come with these different competencies that you may not afford to hire when you are starting up. And that's what should guide, and then have regular meetings, and those people really hold, because the challenge for many organizations is a founder-director era. because this is a person that has a vision and symbolizes the organization. So board members are reluctant to push the person, whereas they need to know that this is actually the type of persons that need them the most. You know, they are often driven by passion, but they need to be brought back to life that, you know, there are certain structures and institutional framework that will drive the realization of this passion and goal you have. And if those, you know, contributions are not made, the organization will suffer in terms of sustainability.
Interesting. And you talked quite a bit about challenges, opportunities, leadership in the nonprofit space. And some of the examples focused on Nigeria, and a lot of the issues cut across the region. Now, regionally speaking, what are the prospects? What does the future look like? You know, for nonprofits in Africa, considering some of the challenges.
I actually think, you know, my position as regional director of Ford Foundation exposes me to work in other countries in the sub-region, and of course interacting with my colleagues in other regions in Africa. I hate to say this, that institutionally speaking, it would appear that groups in other countries are doing better than Nigeria. Take, for instance, Ghana. In Ghana, you can count a number of NGOs that are established and playing leadership role in a sustainable way across sectors. Across sectors. But in Nigeria, you would struggle to find them. You know, groups come, do fantastic work, after a few years, start going down. Either their founder directors moved on to something else, or when they grow to a phase where the founder director need to exist to bring in more bloods to take it to the next level, they will not do that and it implodes. You know, again, this is where corporate governance failure is stuck, and also regulatory environment. You know, so other groups, yes, they are facing the common challenges of dependency on donor funding and all of that, but they seem to have done better. And this is unfortunate because in the early 90s, we used to pride ourselves that the groups in Nigeria, you know, were among the strongest in Africa. I don't think we can say that today. You may count a few, but even in those few organizations, the competencies, the expertise, the exposures, the network revolve around their founders. If you remove their founders, you struggle to find who else will hold this place if this person moves on.
And the question is, in relation to that, is it an attitude thing? Is it a mindset thing? Is it a deliberate failure, in other words?
It's a cultural thing. I think it's also systemic in our environment. So not just in the non-profit. If you look at the private sector, you look at the public sector, which are the institutions that we can readily name on our fingertips that are strong and have survived generations of leadership? It's difficult to come by. So you have an agency, an MDA, that under one administration did fantastic thing, and then the person leaves, nothing. You find private sector companies really, doing well, and then there's a transition. So I don't want to single out the non-profit sector. There is something wrong in our system that it doesn't want. We don't seem to be good at mega management. You know, when things grow, whether it's non-profit organization, businesses, or public sector agencies, when they grow, they seem to outgrow the management competencies of those who are running them, which raises question about the leaders we are raising across sectors, the institutions we are building across sectors. Are we building them to survive their founders? Are we building them to survive generations? Are we building them to resist the ebbs and flows that you have in any society or jurisdiction? So that's what I find really interesting, and it's something we may need to devote some scholarships on why can't we build mega businesses, mega corporations. Look at all mega enterprises that are run by people who develop their management competencies here and how they are struggling at a certain phase in their
They
lives.
can't scale.
Yeah,
They can't
yeah,
be healthy
you
where they're
yeah,
bigger.
yeah.
So it's a big issue. And so, on a final note, related to this, what kind of management? The landscape has changed. There was a time that all you needed to do is to shout really loud, and you can make progress in the space and drive funds, do the work you need to do. But in terms of the competencies and capacities now required to make change in the social sector, what does that look like? What is that?
I think it required very clear, deliberate intentionality to really do what you have to do to grow the organization. The era of shouting obscenities at government and getting headlines are gone. We are in a supposed democracy to challenge systems, to get things done, to drive change. You have to come to the table with a number of competencies that will make people take you seriously in the first place and will also make you deliver. People need to know that you really have, that you have a model of growing your institutions to sustainability. But above all, is also to realize that you're just one amongst a number of other groups that need to come together. So the whole idea of just building a hub for everything where you don't need to interact with others. I think the 21st century is a century of teams and teaming. No one individual can solve the problem facing our society, our region, or the world by acting alone, no matter how well resourced. So we need to think in a way that sees ourselves as just one node that need to bring in other nodes, and in a constellation of nodes, move the needle. And also that things, especially when you are evolutionary in your approach and not revolutionary, that you play your own role and leave the stage for others, and then prepare the institutions for that transition. The typical example I give is St. Paul in the Bible. If you look at the first books he wrote, whether it's the Romans or the Corinthians, he thought as if it was him alone that was going to do it. And he was in such a haste to carry out his assignment that he had no time to build institutions, he had no time to develop individuals, and that was why at a stage he advised people who are not married not to marry, and those who are married to live as if they are not married, because the second coming of Christ was so near that if you spend your time doing all of this, you will waste your time. But when he started, if you look at his letter writings, whether his letter to Timothy, he first of all said, let the bishop be a husband of one wife. And that is how he takes care of his family, that will determine how he will take care of the household of God. So he has reached that institutional phase of developing the church that he was now more bothered about setting up structures, setting up the moral examples that people need, as opposed to when he started, when in comparative religion we call it feeling of eschatology, which is that the second coming of Christ was so imminent. You know, when you are born again, you feel that Christ is coming the next day. But when you stay over a while, you realize that this is something that is going to perhaps take generations to happen, and then that inculcates in you the understanding that you need to lay structures of growth, structures of succession, and above not something an individual alone can do.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. I don't want to end, but this is, I promise, the very last. So we started talking about the challenge of institutional building in this sector being one that is, one key challenge being the absence of a vision for what change looks like and for the society that we're moving towards. So fast forward 30 plus years of been on this journey. What's the vision? What's the vision for you?
Yeah, so for me, when I leave this job, I don't think I will work in the non-profit sector. I might volunteer, but it will not be my primary preoccupation because I think we are getting to a stage where the free money approach to solving social problems may have reached its zenith, which is why you are hearing a lot about social enterprises, a mixture of non-profit, for-profits, because there is something to say about when somebody knows that this support given to you is not only going to be paid back, but it will be paid back with an interest, no matter how marginal. There's a discipline, a financial discipline, a credit discipline that it inculcates, that cascades to everything the individual or the institution does. I think we may need to gradually introduce that within the non-profit sector. I'm not saying every problem can be solved through social enterprises. No, there are still things that can be done for free. I mean, a woman running away from abusive husband needs legal assistance, needs shelter, transit shelter. But at some point when she's settled, in terms of the support she needs to then build a life, a microcredit that has a payback and interest is actually what will help her go on to live her life than being in a shelter where she's fed 3 times a day. So we need to, do that within the non-profit sector. Ask ourselves, what are we doing that a social enterprise model can solve? And then what needs to remain within the grants and non-profit, which is why I'm spending a lot of my time now promoting impact investing, looking at the angel investment that will target unserved communities, marginalized communities, vulnerable communities, and support them to grow their businesses in such a way that they will be able to take care of themselves and their families, because donor funding alone cannot solve it. And that's why Africa is saying now what we need is investment, not donor aid. I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I am beginning to spend a little more of my time asking myself, how can that play out? And when I leave, that's actually what I want to do more of.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Lagos Business School, Pan Atlantic University.